All right, so we are on Chaf Hey Amud Aleph 25a. So what we're about to do now, what we're in the middle of doing, is trying to discover whether or not a woman must be warned before she loses her ketubah. So we're learning here in the Talmud Sotah that suspected infidelity. She was behind closed doors with someone. Becoming a Sotah is grounds for losing the ketubah. And we were introduced to a text from the Talmud elsewhere, which tells us that a woman who voluntarily leaves the faith, leaves the religious context of their marriage, also forfeits her ketubah. Now, the reason why we're discussing it here in Sotah is because we want to see if we can derive from the laws of Sotah that a warning is necessary to make her lose the ketubah. Right? Because the Sotah law begins with a warning. He warns her, don't seclude yourself with so-and-so. She then goes ahead and does seclude herself. And then the Sotah proceeding begins. He takes her to the temple to drink the water and so on. And part of the consequences are that she loses her rights to the ketubah. So we're trying to see from the law of Sotah if indeed the fact that she loses her ketubah is the result of her misbehavior, or is it the result of the warning? So we introduced a few different scenarios that might have helped us. Namely, we introduced cases in which the husband warns her about secluding herself with a certain person, but he doesn't take her to drink the Sotah waters. And the reason he doesn't is because they're not fully married, or because their relationship is such that Torah says they shouldn't be married, high priest to a widow, ordinary Kohen to a divorcee. So in those cases, where there's no going to the temple to drink the water, yet she is warned and she loses her ketubah. So perhaps then there's a link. She's warned so that she should lose her ketubah. Or to rephrase that, her losing of the ketubah is a consequence of the warning. But the Gemara rejected these suggestions because in each of these cases, there's another reason for why she must be warned. Either because later when they get married, he can rely on the warning he gave earlier to take her to the temple to drink the Sotah water, or perhaps by warning her, and then she violates that warning and secludes herself with a certain person, she then becomes forbidden to marry that person. There are other consequences to the warning, which leaves us unclear yet as to whether that warning is necessary to make her lose a ketubah. Maybe she loses the ketubah because of her misbehavior. As for the warning, there's other halachic consequences. So this is where we are. And finally, the Gemara quotes the source that will resolve the issue. So I'm highlighting the text here. Rabbi Chanina states, Misura, Rabbi Chanina comes from Sura. Sura being one of the two popular cities in Babylonia where the Jews lived at the time, two centers of Torah, Pompedisa and Sura. So Rabbi Chanina comes from Sura. So he said, Tashma, come and listen to the following text, which will resolve our issue, answer our question. And this is from our Mishnah here in Sotah. The Mishnah reads, Ve'elu, and the following are cases, shebezdin mikanan lahem, where the bezdin can step in and warn the woman in lieu of the husband. So we're going to list cases in which the husband is incapable of issuing a warning to his wife, but the bezdin sees that she's going down a path of promiscuity. So the bezdin will step in and warn her in lieu of the husband. And they are the following cases. Number one, mishin is charish baila, if the husband became a mute, so he can no longer properly communicate, and perhaps she's taking advantage of that, and she's now hanging out with other people in a suspicious manner, so he can't issue the warning because he's gone mute. So the bezdin will come in and issue the warning. Likewise, oinishtata, or if the man, translating a little crass, literally, went, quote, crazy. Nishtata coming from the word shoita, which sounds something like the person had a nervous breakdown or a mental breakdown of some sort. And now he's incapacitated, he's incapable of issuing a warning because of his mental state. So again, perhaps maybe she's taking advantage of this situation, that he's no longer mentally capable of communicating to her properly. Maybe one day he'll get healed, God willing, he will. But at the moment, he's not in that position. And maybe perhaps she's taking advantage, and therefore the Beis Din will step in and warn her. Likewise, or a man who was locked in jail. So again, he's incapable of warning her because he's in jail. He's not even aware of what she's doing. And again, she might be taking advantage, so the Beis Din will step in. As I mentioned, when we studied this passage first in the Mishnah, going to jail today in our culture is a negative thing. Clearly, thank God our justice system is not without fault, obviously, no system is without fault, but by and large, it's functioning very well. And therefore, for the most part, if someone is in jail in the Western world, we can safely assume the person belongs there, or the person did some crime. I'm sure there are exceptions, and certainly are, but as by and large, we can trust the justice system. But in history, that was not the case. Throughout history, jailing could be simply because the local landlord decided you didn't pay your rent the way he wanted, when you wanted, and therefore he threw you in jail. Or, I don't know, you practiced Judaism in a place a time and place that the local governor decided wasn't appropriate and threw you in jail. So being in jail was not necessarily indicative of anything negative about the person. It could just be the circumstances of history that landed him in jail. It doesn't even have to be because he didn't pay rent. It could, or because he was practicing Jewishly. It could simply be for ransom. This happened. People ended up in jail simply because they wanted ransom. And this was unfortunately rampant, especially targeted against Jews.
Levi,
yeah.
Could this work? This works. I presume this works vice versa.
Where if she ends up in such a situation,
where he's the one who's fooling around.
Yeah. So he's bound by the ketubah to take care of her.
Right.
If she ends up in jail, he is obligated by the ketubah to pay her bail to get her out. He's responsible for that. So he's definitely held responsible by the ketubah to take care of her if one of these things were to happen to her, God forbid. And if he didn't, then this Beis Din would step in as well, considering he's violating his ketubah. But in this case, it's a question not of her keeping up her end of the ketubah, but more her retaining her right to the ketubah, right? Because the ketubah is really a document that protects her. It gives her rights.
Right.
So because of the situation, he himself can't implement whatever he has to get done. So the Beis Din will step in. Okay, so now here's the part of the Mishnah that's relevant to our discussion. The Mishnah states, "Loi lahashkoisa amru." When they said the Beis Din has the right to step in and warn the woman in the cases mentioned above where the husband's incapable, he's gone mute, he mental breakdown, he's in jail. So the Beis Din steps in and warns her. Says the Mishnah, he steps in to warn her not that she should be taken to the temple to drink the water. That's not the reason for the warning, says the Mishnah. In fact, it's quite possible, at least according to one opinion, he cannot take her to the temple because he didn't issue a warning. Let's say he got out of jail and she secluded herself with this person that the Beis Din warns her about. He cannot take her to the temple because he never warned her. And therefore, this opinion at least says the warning that the Beis Din does is not for the sake of her drinking the water, but rather Ella lapoisla miksubasa. The reason why Beis Din steps in and warns her against misbehaving is so that the husband is not liable to pay for the ksuba when this woman is fooling around. That's the reason why they step in. So Shmamina, from here we can derive boy hasra, that she requires a warning. Because here the Mishnah states clearly, explicitly, the Beis Din steps in to warn on behalf of the husband. For what purpose? So that she will lose her ketubah if she's fooling around. That's the reason, to protect him, but not to take her to the temple and make her go through the whole proceeding of drinking the certain water. That's not the point. That's only if the two of them, if he warns her and the two of them have to deal with that issue, then they go to the temple. But if the Bezdin stepping in, they're simply doing it to protect him so he doesn't have to pay for ketubah for a woman who's been fooling around. So here we see clearly that in order for a woman to lose her right to the ketubah, she must be warned about her behavior. Indeed, the Gemara concludes, Shma mina, yes, indeed, we can derive from here that a woman requires a warning before she loses her ketubah. And this remains the halacha. Now, the final comment on this discussion, the Gemara asks as follows, a very simple question. All the other scholars mentioned before, last week, we presented two other options, two other sources, and we suggested to resolve the issue as to whether or not she requires a warning before she loses her ketubah. So the Gemara asks, "My taima loy omri maha." Why did they not quote this source? The source we read this morning is so explicit. It says straight up, the reason the Bezdin is warning her, is not to make her drink in the temple, but so that she loses her right to the ketubah. The Mishnah states clearly there must be a warning before she loses her right to the ketubah. So why didn't they just quote this text to begin with? It seems so explicit. Why did they quote cases about an engaged woman where it's ambiguous? Was the warning for the sake of some other reason, or was the warning for the sake of the losing of the ketubah? And we have to break our heads. What's the reason for the warning? Why not just quote this text, which is straight out? The Bezdin warns a woman when the husband can't, in order to protect him from paying a ketubah when he doesn't have to, in order to make it right that she forfeits her right to the ketubah. So why not just quote this text? It seems so explicit. So the Gemara, therefore, is compelled now to find some minor fault in the logic, because otherwise, what were the other guys thinking? Why didn't they just quote this text? So there must be some other way to think about this text that doesn't resolve the issue completely, but the Gemara at the end still accepts that this is the ruling. So here's the small slight fault in the logic that explains why the original scholars did not quote this text, even though it seems so explicit. Says the Gemara, Dilma, perhaps shiny Hassan, the case of the Bezdin stepping in to warn the woman is a bit different than a case where a husband is warning the woman. How's that? The Leslie a Masa the Baal cloud. She no longer has a Masa, literally means fear, but I think in more broadly it means awe, reverence, respect. Her husband's not around, and because her husband's not around, naturally speaking, she there's a loneliness that comes along with this. We can't fully blame her for, we described it earlier as her taking advantage of the situation, which is possible. But on the other hand, we can't blame her. Let's say the guy's stuck in jail for 10 years. She's sitting alone for a long time. And there's a neighbor who's being kind to her, helping her, maybe even helping pay the bills in the house. And a relationship like that begins. We're going to say that she's a bad person and lose her ketubah just like that. So maybe that's why the Bezdin needs to come in and give a warning. But when her husband's around, maybe a warning is not necessary. So here we see that even though the Mishnah states explicitly that the reason why the Bezdin steps in and gives the warning is in order for her to lose the ketubah, it's possible that the reason why the Mishnah says that is only specific to this case, because her husband is not around. And because she doesn't have the reverence and awe for her husband, because he's off somewhere stuck in a jail, or God forbid, stuck in a hospital somewhere. So we cannot blame her completely for being in this compromised state. And therefore, the only way she'll lose her ketubah is if the Bezdin steps in and says, look, we understand your predicament, we understand it's difficult, but you're still married to your husband, and you can't be doing this with another man. Then the Bezdin needs to step in, and that's why it's important that they're there. And then she can lose her ketubah. Because otherwise, without that warning, we cannot hold her accountable, and therefore she would retain the right to her ketubah. But if her husband's not in jail, her husband's right there at home, and she chooses to behave promiscuously, then perhaps she doesn't need a warning. Perhaps just the fact that she's misbehaving with her husband at home, that itself is enough for her to forfeit her ketubah. So we see already two sides to the story. Although, as I mentioned before, the Gemara still accepts, and the halacha still remains, that a woman does not lose her ketubah unless she's explicitly warned, either by the Bezdin or by the husband. But at least we see another side to the coin, that maybe, only in a case where the husband's not around, then you need a warning before she loses a ketubah, because we can't fully blame her. But if her husband around, maybe then we don't need a warning. Although again, the halacha remains that she does need a warning in all cases. So this resolves that issue, the issue we've been discussing for the last few classes, which is whether or not a woman needs a warning before she loses her ketubah if she's been misbehaving, either voluntarily leaving the religious context of their marriage, or she's behaving in a suspicious manner with another man, and we conclude that yes, she needs that warning. Now the Gemara introduces another inquiry, another related question. So we'll begin the question, and tomorrow we'll start looking at the Gemara's resolution. But let's at least frame the question.
Levi, before you start, this was a big problem in the Second World War, where there was men who were married men missing in action. Absolutely. For many years.
Yep. And
presumed dead, and the woman marries, and then the guy shows up.
Yeah, that's a very related issue, like the aguna issue. But even before the presumption of death, there were times when a husband's off to war, no communication, or maybe they know that the guy's alive, but they don't, and she's lonely, and she's alone, and she has a kid or two, and a neighbor's helping, all starting off very innocently, and these things develop over time. Sure.
Yeah.
It certainly happens. I mean, it unfortunately happens with people who have to go on frequent business trips too. So it's interesting how, like, this is something that the judge and I would discuss quite often, this idea that even though there's a law, there's also the sensitivity in the law, right? So the law at the end of the day is, okay, the warning has to be issued, but the way the Gemara formulates its thinking about the law, it also introduces us to a sensitivity towards the woman. Until this point, you would think, oh, she's misbehaving, write her off, she loses her ketubah. But the Gemara is introducing another angle, the whole picture. Maybe she's lonely, and it's not by her fault that she's lonely. Maybe it's not even by his fault that she's lonely, because he's at war, or he's stuck in jail, or who knows what. So whatever the law becomes at the end, in terms of how she loses her ketubah, all these sensitivities are required to be taken into consideration.
This could have been the case when those two Michaels were in China for a couple of years. They were locked up in China.
I'm not familiar.
Yeah, sure. It was in the news all the time.
Wait, how long ago was this?
Just last year.
Really?
Yeah. You remember there was the woman for that company, Hawaii, was detained here in Vancouver, and these two Michaels were out in China, and they were put in jail. And if they wouldn't, if this would have been a long time ago,
they wouldn't know.
There would be no communications. Nobody would ever know.
That's right. That's right. So a woman like that, she loses a ketubah.
Yeah.
Without a warning, just lose a ketubah. There's got to be some sensitivity to everybody.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, so let's frame the question for tomorrow. The following was presented to them, right? So I mentioned this when we first introduced the other question, which is the various different ways the Gemara formulates or words the question. In this case, because the root word here is boyi, these three letters, which means an inquiry, and then iboya was, it was inquired, lahu, by them. So which means one person presented to the study hall the following inquiry. The person asking the question has no agenda, just wants to know. And the question is like this. Oiveres aldas. If this woman we've been talking about, who voluntarily leaves the religious context of their relationship, and as we just discussed, and we concluded, she must be warned before she loses her ketubah. Okay. And we learned this is grounds for divorce. Now the question is, the rotza bala kaima. What if the husband wants to stay married to her? What if he wants to stay married to her? Even if he's not necessarily going down the path of irreligiosity like her. Maybe not. Maybe he's retaining his religiosity. But because of whatever the circumstances are, he feels that he wants to stay married to this woman, notwithstanding the fact that she's no longer religious as they expected when he first got married. So Mekaima, can he stay married to her? Or perhaps Aina Mekaima. Perhaps no. He's obligated to divorce her. I don't know that we're going to force him to divorce her, but the obligation is upon him. That's the question. Is he obliged to stay married to her or not? So what would be the two sides of the coin? Mi amrinan, do we say on the one hand, the kepeda the Baal Tala Rahmana, the Torah leaves it up to the discretion of the husband. Does he care? So if he cares about her misconduct, so he can come to the Beth Din and say, look, we got married in a religious context. We expected of each other to behave a certain way, and she's voluntarily leaving. I have nothing against her, but it's not the kind of woman I want to live with. I want a divorce. And if he doesn't do that, if he says I'm okay with it, good. So you're okay with it. Stay married. And therefore, he doesn't care. That's on the one hand. On the one hand, we can say that Torah leaves it to his discretion. The reason why Torah is saying her misbehavior is grounds for divorce is because Torah is saying, look, you may not like this. And if you don't like this, we understand, and therefore you can divorce. Or perhaps, kivan the kapit. Because Torah decided that by and large, people care, therefore this becomes like almost a standard. When such a situation happens, the law, as it were, cares, and therefore the law obligates him to divorce. This is the two sides of the coin. Is this a legal imposition? The law decides that a husband ought to care when his wife misbehaves, and therefore the law says you should probably divorce? Or is the law itself saying, look, do you care or not? If you care, you have the right. If you don't care, good, stay married. These are the two sides of the coin. Just to make it clearer, see, when it comes to infidelity, let's say, a woman is, definitive evidence and proof with the witnesses and all that she was unfaithful. In that case, he legally is supposed to divorce her. Even though in theory, if he wants to, he can stay married to her, but that's not the point of our discussion. The point I'm trying to say is that he actually is obligated to divorce her because of the breakdown of their marriage. The law says this is a not sustainable marriage. The law says this is an illegal type of relationship, and therefore you should divorce. So does the same thing happen with a woman who behaves irreligiously now? The Torah says this is the kind of thing that you ought to be caring about, and therefore you ought to divorce. Or is Torah saying, look, we understand if you care about it, and therefore we give you the right to divorce, but if you don't care, that's okay, stay married. These are the two sides of the coin. And we'll get tomorrow, God willing, into the Gemara's resolving the issue. Okay,
Levi. So grateful to you. God bless you. You should go from strength to strength. All the very best to you, Alan. All the very best to you all. Have a wonderful day.
Have a good day.
Take care.